Hi kids, you're sitting down writing your rhetorical analysis essay, and here's a review if you need it. Your rhetorical analysis essay is about the strategies that the author is using in the text. And it's not enough to find them, you have to explain how they work. So be careful that you're not writing a summary of the passage or your response as an argument to the passage. What you're doing is you're finding the main rhetorical devices that the author's relying on to create his or her argument, and you're explaining how they work. So the first thing you need to do is you need to read the passage. Make sure that you annotate it so that you can find your way back as you're writing your essay, that you identify what you believe are the main devices. That's your argument in this paper. You are saying these are the main devices that this author is using to create this argument. You develop your argument about the author's devices. Make sure you discuss the purpose, why he or she is writing this, what he or she wants to accomplish as a result of writing this, or in the case of a speech, speaking it, what audience they intend to reach. And once you've identified that and make sure that you write it down on the passage so it's there for you to find, then you start writing. Okay, once you start writing, you need to write a solid introduction. So make sure that you do the following. You do need to summarize the essay briefly, 1 or 2 sentences, okay? Just briefly. You need to outline the speaker's thesis and main argument so that you're setting up what the writer's trying to do, and then your body paragraphs are going to show how he or she does it. Okay? So you want to make a reference to what the author is saying, or writing, really, and how it is said, and that's where you get into tone and the classical appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos, and perhaps some of the other grammatical and rhetorical strategies. That will be in the body paragraphs of your essay. Do not write a sentence such as the author uses tone and several rhetorical devices to make the argument that blah, blah, blah. You need to be specific, okay? In a pinch, but only in a pinch, you can start with a rhetorical précis. It will work in this case, and pretty much every case. However, for our purposes, especially in the first few rhetorical analysis essays that you're writing them in class with a lot of support. So I want to see a real solid introduction. In a timed writing situation, you can fall back on the rhetorical précis, and it will work for you. So there you go. So now we're on to your body paragraphs. There's no hard and fast rule about how many that you need. You don't have to have 3. You don't have to have a 5-paragraph essay. Each of your body paragraphs needs to be its own entity that serves your argument about how the author is creating meaning. And if you do that in 2 long, solid, well-developed paragraphs, 3, 4, it's okay, as long as you have a full and developed rhetorical analysis essay. So, in each of your body paragraphs, you want to focus on a main rhetorical strategy that is used by the author, and you want to explain the effect. So each body paragraph should focus on one significant one that you develop fully and explain fully, or perhaps there's a couple that you put together because they're related and they're being used in the same way. But that's what each paragraph should contain. Okay? You want to comment on how the writer organized the text. You want to talk about or write about. Don't write, talk. You want to write about how the argument developed. For instance, in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, he starts out with an address that explains why he's taking time to respond to these clergymen before he launches into his point-by-point argument. And his argument builds one idea on the other. If you are writing a rhetorical analysis of that piece of work, you would want to make sure that you note where you are in your analysis, where you are in his essay, and point out how that part of his argument developed from the previous paragraphs and sets the stage for the future paragraphs. So you want to make sure that you're discussing that as well. A little bit more about your body paragraphs. When you are writing your body paragraphs, there are two things that are probably important in every piece of work. It is diction and tone. However, it is not enough to use those words. If you use the word diction and you use the word tone, you need to use an adjective along with it to describe the author's diction and to describe the author's tone. For instance, back to Martin Luther King and his letter from a Birmingham jail. His tone is passionate. He is making an ardent plea to his fellow clergymen. And his diction is elevated. He is making allusions to the Bible in service of his argument. It is formal. It is not at all conversational. You also want to look at shifts in tone and diction when it changes. In his letter to a Birmingham jail, there is a shift at one point in his letter when he goes from addressing his fellow clergymen about the points in their argument to stating his disappointment in the church and the church's leaders in their failure to take up his cause. And there is a shift there, and his tone becomes almost morose. He is disappointed. His diction becomes a little less elevated because he is making a different kind of plea. Now, if you're reading something and there are several instances of figurative language, you'd want to address that. Sometimes some of the things that we read will not have that. The author, instead of using figurative language such as similes and metaphors, and imagery and all that sort of stuff, they will instead rely on some other type of rhetorical device. If it's there, though, you probably want to mention it. One thing you may want to look at also is the length of paragraphs and the length and style of sentences. When we covered Letter from a Birmingham Jail in class, you probably noticed that the length of paragraphs and the style of sentences is quite different from the work of Steinbeck that we covered in class. The tone's different, the diction is different, the paragraphs are arranged differently because they're serving a different purpose. You also want to look at the organization of paragraphs so that you're looking at how the author's argument is developing one paragraph to the other. In your conclusion, you want to comment on the effect of the essay as a whole. The author has a purpose. They're trying to make something happen as a result of that essay. And you want to discuss that overall effect that you may have even touched on in your introduction and pieces of it in your body paragraphs, and now you want to look at the whole. When I talk about using the conclusion to comment on the effectiveness, that is not your call to applaud the writer. Instead, you're looking at how in history, if you have that information, how that piece of work affected the audience that the author intended it to affect. Okay? You want to drive home your argument of what's found in the text. You say these 3 or 4 things are what drive this essay and create the meaning of it, and you want to come back and address that. Okay? Avoid the sound of applause. Okay? Stick with responding to the argument and its art and its organization instead of perhaps speaking about what a great writer that person is or how you were personally moved or something like that. Leave that out of your essay completely, and particularly your conclusion. And now finally, here are some tips for the whole essay. You want to use present tense because writing is always alive in the moment. So when you're writing an essay, if you're referring to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, you would use is instead of was, write instead of wrote, pleads instead of pled, etc. Remember your tag, title, author, genre. If you're unclear of the genre, you can always use the word passage or excerpt. You need to refer to yourself if you must refer to yourself, which you probably want to avoid doing if at all possible. But if you are going to refer to yourself as the reader or the audience. Never use the word you. Avoid that completely. Replace it with something more specific. Okay? In your body paragraphs, you need to support your claims with direct quotations. You need to take direct quotations from the text. You also probably want to rely somewhat on paraphrased information. So that if you say the author is using this device for this purpose, you need to quote where it is. The sentence, the phrase. If you're talking about anaphora, it would be several phrases or several sentences, and you need to put that quote in there. Make sure that the bulk of your paragraph, though, is not quoting the passage. The bulk of the paragraph is your essay. But you do need to have quotes from the passage and paraphrased information to support what you're saying is going on in that essay, okay? Or speech or poem or whatever. You want to, at all costs, avoid the rhetorical analysis scavenger hunt list essay. Do not simply list the devices that you find and quote them, perhaps, and call it good. You need to truly respond to the text and discuss how those devices are working in that essay. Good luck to you. Write a great essay.